I don't know how many of you get emails about crowdsourcing, right? It's like, this is the latest discussion that's going to change the world. Most of you, a lot of you are old enough to remember that the futures people actually did a lot of work on crowdsourcing. Began quite systematically using the Delphi technique that was developed by Rand at the late 50s. And they really ran hundreds of Delphis. In 1964, Ted Gordon and Olaf Helmer actually published a book. It was a report on long-term forecast, it was called. And it got a lot of attention, got some things right, predicted things like oral contraceptives and lightweight materials. They got some things really wrong, like landing people on Mars. But I was always fascinated by this process. And when I went to in the Environmental Protection Agency in the late 89, early 90s, I set up a future studies unit. EPA actually had a unit that did futures research. And I was always interested in how to use the Delphi, but it always seemed kind of difficult to use and rather cumbersome. So I used other things, cross-impact analysis, scenario planning. And I had this computer on my desk. This was a Macintosh SE. SE stands for System Expansion. So it had a card slot in the back, and I put a card in it, and I hooked it to the internet. I don't know why they let me do this, but they didn't resist. And all of a sudden, I had a PC on the internet. This was about 1990. There wasn't much going on then. You know, we were a little far, a year or two before Tim Berners-Lee actually would put together the hypertext protocol. But there were a bunch of things out there, Veronica, Gopher, Waze. Some of you might remember these. And so I set my computer up in Gopher, and I gave it the address U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So anybody that was in Gopher and went after EPA ended up in my computer. And nobody really knew much about this, but pretty soon people started coming in my door. I got a call from Apple saying, "What are you doing with our Mac?" In a large bureaucracy. You've got it hooked up to the internet. There was a guy in a ponytail that walked in one day. His name was Jeff Brown. He was the co-founder of Maxis. He would go on to build SimCity. And he asked me, "We'd like to put games on your computer." Another guy came in by the name of Brewster Kale, who set up something called the Wayback Machine, but he wanted us to create a large futures library. And then Jerry Glenn came in with Ted Gordon, and they sat across from me and they said, we want to create a global intelligence network. We want to create the ability to do real-time Delphi. We want to give you the ability to sort of ding a network on a constant basis. And we want to have this up and running for a long time so we get better at it. We can explore different kinds of questions, statistical analyses. So I'm listening to this and looking at my computer and sort of wondering, where do I send the check? Right? And so we decide, this actually wasn't easy to send the check because I had to send a check to the United Nations University, and no government agency in the US had ever funded these people. But I ended up sending the check, which actually funded the feasibility study for the Millennium Project. And as a government employee at that time, I can now look back and say this was probably one of the best investments I made, because most of the other things that I tried to do are long gone. And yet this continues to go on. A year later, EPA had wised up and pulled the plug on my internet connection, saying that I had violated some standard. I don't know quite what it was. By then, I had downloaded hundreds of thousands of my documents around the world. And a bunch of my colleagues finally figured out that having a personal computer on your desk was quite powerful. And we launched the Millennium Project. So that was sort of the story off of my desktop in 1990. And with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We're not going to be able to cover everything in this book in 20 or 30 minutes or so forth. It's a little bit like trying to do a briefing on the Encyclopedia Britannica. Where do you start? So a lot of my stuff, I will say, is my subjective judgments on what I think is important about this. And my colleagues will say different things that are important, hopefully. We changed the format. You'll notice it's smaller. I'm going to see if people like that. I see some heads saying that they liked it smaller. It has the advantage that I don't have to worry about space as I did in the past. We would, some of you may know, we would do 15 global challenges, and you get a page of the basic situation and a page on the regional stuff, and maybe some charts. And we would kill ourselves to make everything very compressed. We still compressed a lot, but it's a little more elbow room. So we think this is the best we've ever done. It's still not verbose. I mean, it's still very precise, but it is in greater depth and greater breadth, and every year we're supposed to get smarter by feedback from all kinds of different systems. So the executive summary, I think you all really should read. It's about 7 pages or so. If that's not the best 7 pages on what you should consider important about the future, then I want to know what is, and we will study it, and we'll make it better next year. So we will. Chapter 1 is 15 global challenges. We did make a change this year. We've been asked time and time again, do something on education. And I say, well, education hits everything. All the challenges, have to be addressed by education. So in any case, we merged 2 things having to do with decision-making into one, and then we opened up education. So that's new in there. Another thing that's new in there are infographics. Elena, you want to wave your hand back there? In the book, you'll see a lot of infographics that were not there in the past. We hope you like them. If you don't, send a note to Elena about how to improve them. Chapter 2 is on hidden hunger. This is an extraordinarily important problem that people are not taken seriously yet enough. We keep measuring calories, and we're not measuring the rest of the stuff as much. The urban coastal zones, we got a wake-up warning in the United States and New York. The flood went into the subway. Well, if the climate change continues, as we expect it to continue, this is an early indicator of coming attractions. So we really got to talk about the urban natural infrastructure around the world. Number 4, chapter 4 is on lone wolves and CMAD, single individual massively destructive. We all know that sometimes somebody goes wacko and grabs a gun. Imagine what they can do, go wacko and grab some synthetic biology. So this is something that's got to be dealt with seriously. The last chapter is on the Global Futures Intelligence System, which we introduced here, I think it was last November or whenever it was, which has grown, and we hope you'll find it useful. We think it's the best integration system around. We're also putting one into Egypt at the moment as well, called ISIS. It's the Integrated Synergetic Information System. I did not make up the name. That was them, by the way. I know it sounds like a jerry dropping, but it's not mine. In any case, ISIS. And we've transferred software, and hopefully we're going to do some more customization and go off to Egypt. This is an interesting time to try to do a collective intelligence for a country. This will be the first one. We did a collective intelligence for Kuwait, but that was for the Prime Minister's office. It was not a public one. We've done some of the oil company and other things like that. But this will be the first one for a country that's open to the public. Okay, State of the Future Index. For those of you who are familiar with them in the past, we've been saying that the progress is slowing down compared to the past 20 years, and is now clearly caught up. If you take a look at this clearly, you'll see that the last 5 years have basically no real improvement. Now, that obviously it's got a lot to do, lion's share to do, with the financial crisis in 2008. But you can see it bounced along and bounced along and bounced along. We think, however, that, along with many other people, that a lot of the basic dynamics are moving in the right direction now. So we may be, coming back out of that. But you'll notice it's not as dramatic as it was before. For those of you who are not familiar with the State of the Future Index, the idea is to create a measure of progress that's more valuable than the cost of living index or the GDP or the Human Development Index. It's only 4 variables, really. What we did is we asked people years ago, and we re-asked the question again, how do we measure progress on each of these 15 challenges? And where's the good data sources? We've got to have about 20 years of data for us to go out 10, as we just made up that ratio of 2 to 1. And then we asked people what's the best it could be and worst it could be. So that gives us a range of bad to good, right? We project through that range of good to bad, and we say, is a 0.1 or a 0.5 between 0 and 1, and we add all that up, and that's how we integrate the index of the State of the Future. Now, how this becomes useful is that you can then say, okay, if I keep all the variables the same, but I improve one, say 10% or 20% or whatever, does it make much of a difference out here? Yes or no? And do all those. And then you can start to say, what's the best bang for the buck? Now, we did this for Azerbaijan last year. We showed them that here's 3 big bangs for the buck. The president took the little report, went off and all the ministers within 10 days had to come up with a 10-year plan. So it's a nice, useful tool, because we all know that if we have an argument and somebody goes to the hospital, GDP went up. But it's clearly the quality of life, at least for the person in the hospital, did not go up. And we think this is we do it for the world, but we also help other countries do it. It can also be for industries. We haven't done one for industries yet, but it'd be nice. But it asks the right question. If the future is better in 10 years, what do you really mean? Let's be specific. What do you really mean? Do you mean more Cadillacs? Do you mean more PhDs? What do you mean? And it forces a conversation, because it's silly to, in a sense, reduce the entire future to a number. We realize that. But it's not silly to argue about what's important and what you can measure, and then do sensitivity analysis. That's useful, because then you get a little more objective analysis of where to invest. So it ends up with a report card for the world. Here we take all the indicators and say, where are we winning and where are we losing and where we're uncertain. We are clearly winning with life expectancy. We're up to 70 years, a little over 70 years in the world. This isn't the United States, this is world stuff. All the numbers I'm referring to are world, okay? Population growth is slowing down in a positive way. We've got problems later on. Now, prevalence of undernourishment, that's where this calorie stuff comes in. We're doing great with calorie improvements, but we're not doing as great with the nutritional improvements. Child mortality, people are living longer. We've got more fresh water per person, but we've also got water tables going down. That's going to catch up with us soon. People are getting better educated. There's a whole bunch of these indicators down here where we can say we're winning. And it's important to know where we're winning, because if you think we're not going to be able to do well, we had an interview yesterday. Are you a pessimist or an optimist? That stuff we really should put in the trash can. Because if you're a pessimist, you have no responsibility. It's all going to go downhill. What do I got to do? That's a chicken blankety blank attitude, right? And if you think everything's going to be great, then what do you got to do something anyway? So the dynamics are all there. Well, the truth is we're winning and losing. And where we're winning is great, and where we're losing is deadly serious. For example, our ecological footprint is continuing to get worse. We've been giving these speeches, we've been having these books, but the fact of the matter is we're not improving as well as we ought to be relative to our knowledge. The income inequality has become obscene. You saw the last stuff this year that something like 85 people in the world have half the wealth, and have the same wealth as half the population of the planet? How long can that survive? Now, I think Dennis will be talking a little bit about, and I don't want to steal his thunder here, about as we increasingly get more efficient in many different ways in financial systems, you can have tremendous increasing of wealth, but not a whole lot of employees. You saw that purchase, the other day of WhatsApp or whatever it was, for how many billion and how many employees they got? This is the employment-less growth. Economic growth without employment. This is a deadly serious. We've got to change our attitude and way we train people for the future of making a living. This is well, I don't want to go on too long, but obviously it's an important problem. There's more details in the book. You can read that later on. Terrorism is still, we're not winning on terrorism. Corruption, we're not winning on corruption. The CO2, that's still keep going up. The forest lands are problems. And the water situation on renewables are going bad. Now, where we're not sure, unemployment's bouncing around. We think that's going to get a lot worse, though. Voter turnout's not doing too well, but it's not bouncing around again. Freedom rights, there's some uncertainty there, but the press freedom has gone down. I think there's something like around 52 countries got worse, and 40 countries got better by the Freedom House assessments. So we're improving in a lot of places, but not collectively as well as we ought to. Press freedoms have gone down a little bit for the last 8 years in a row. So the democracy trends are strong for many years, but we can't go to sleep on this stuff. HIV prevalence is beginning to go down, but not very rapidly yet. This is one of the things that I just arbitrarily took one of these charts here. You can see that we've been improving our investment into global health consistently for years, but then it starts to turn over again in 2008, 2009, and goes flat. Some investments into the drug companies, into large-scale systematic immunization systems is not going well. We've got to take this a little more seriously. Now, here's the first infographic. This is for Challenge 1. How can sustainable development be achieved for all while addressing global climate change? We got up to 400 parts per million this year. If we don't add one more molecule of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it still continues to get worse. You understand? It's an accumulative phenomenon that continues on. This is, I first wrote about climate change in 1973. Well, we just looked at global warming in 1973. And I could keep track of forecasts of this area. And every forecast I would check, like 10 years later a forecast, 20 years later a forecast, understated the severity. So when people say we're uncertain, yeah, uncertainty goes in two directions. We have been understating this problem consistently. So if we're going to make a mistake, let's make a mistake in overreacting rather than underreacting. Because we don't know what happened, where that inflection point is later on. Some people have said 1,000 parts per million. I don't know. Hansen, or whatever his name is up in New York, is the best, and he says about 1,000. But people keep giving these speeches, we keep having these conferences, but look at the doggone data. It just keeps on going. Just keeps on going, just keeps on going. So we'd have to do an awful lot of things to get that to turn around. The water situation, the water tables continue to fall on all continents. In China, for at least 10 years now, there have been areas where one day there was water underneath the well, and the next day there wasn't, and they had to have forced migration. Now, when you have forced migration, that means you're going into an area where there's other people. These people that are receiving the new people are not always happy about that. So now imagine this on a global basis as it continues through time. We're going to have new ways of producing water and ways of conserving water. For example, we all know about how much water it takes to make a hamburger, right? You see these little charts. 2,400 liters of water to produce a hamburger. Leather shoe, 8,000 liters, all right? Now, how many of you know about the experiment last year that had produced the first hamburger for testing? How many knew about that one? Good. Now we got to get the price coming down eventually. The first product, by the way, may come out of New Harvest for leather, because the concept of genetically producing tissue can be for anything. It doesn't have to be for a hamburger or meat. It can be for leather, for skin. So you might start to see the shoes producing less water. But also the other is saltwater agriculture. Now, Dennis is probably going to talk a little bit about that, so I won't get into much of that. But as much as we can move from freshwater agriculture to saltwater agriculture, and the more we can move from the animal industry to other approaches to that, then we're freeing up a lot of fresh water, because we've got this conflict between urban and rural and agriculture happening as you see it in California as we speak. Resources and population being brought into balance. One of the big, as I mentioned, that the growth of population is going down. It's still going up, but I mean the rate is starting to go down. The UN forecast change every couple of years. Is now 9.6 billion is the middle forecast. A couple of years ago it was down to 8.9, and it was 9.2. But in any case, we got roughly 2 billion more people coming up, give or take a little bit. Now, the population of the world in 1900 was about 1.3 to 1.6 billion. We're going to have more than the entire population of the world in the next, 30 some odd years, 26 years or so. That's an extraordinary amount we got to get ready for. FAO figures we got to produce 70% more food. Now, that's real food, not the hidden hunger situation. How are we going to produce that? If we don't turn to things like meat without animals, and saltwater agriculture and things like that. 4, democratization. I've already made the comments about that there's been a little interruption in the force there, and the last few years is sort of like not going as rapidly as we would like. Some of the threats we've got to deal with on democracy is organized crime, because they can buy and sell decisions like they buy and sell heroin, making a democracy an illusion. They make twice the amount of money as all the military budgets put together. So imagine you had a military budget of the world, and you decided to influence decisions. Corruption still is 1.6 trillion. By the way, in one of the press releases was sent out, there's a billion and around a trillion. Sorry about that. So if anybody's seeing that press release there, you can strike out the word billion and put in the word trillion. World Bank estimates going up from, it used to be 1 trillion, but now it's like went to 1.6 trillion. It's a lot of decisions being bought. And we also know in the United States that you can now make a financial contribution without having your name attached to it. I wonder if organized crime gets involved in that. Concentration, media ownership, corporate monopolies, increasing lobbying, and impunity. These are some serious threats we've got to get addressed on. This is one of the challenges we merged, the decision-making and future stuff, how we can put that together. This is much of the business of the people in this room. I don't need to lecture you about that. We think the collective intelligence system will be one factor in improving it, because a lot of times, a lot of times people say, well, I was blindsided by something. Well, you're blindsided by something because you're looking in one direction. So how do you have a system looking all around, but organize it in some way where it's not information overload? And that's what we're trying to do with the collective intelligence system. Number 6, how can a global convergence of ICT work for everybody? We're now just about 40% of humanity now. That's pretty doggone good. So it is reasonable to assume that everybody will be connected, they'll be able to access all the public knowledge of the world, so the expression saying, I don't know, can go away. It just means you didn't Google it or you didn't use your system. But to say, I don't know, elbow them, says, Google the thing, check it out. Or someone says, well, I can't afford, college. Okay. You know how many university courses are free of charge right now? Now, granted, you're not getting the degree, and there are now people which we're actually in cooperation with. How can people self-organize around the world, get certified in certain areas, and have internationally recognized bachelor's degrees? And I think that's going to happen. Number 7, how can the ethical market economies how can we encourage ethical market economies to reduce the gap? This we're not addressing well. I think that some of you are aware of the Millennium Development Goals of the UN system, and they're being redone now. And the previous ones all looked at levels. Reduce the level of poverty, which, by the way, has been fabulous lately. I don't even know it, but about something like 30% of the third world was in poverty 2,200 years ago. Now it's around 15%. I mean, we are winning at poverty reduction. So when the UN started and people said, well, this poverty reduction is a silly-ass idea, you can't do that. And the fact of the matter is we've been reducing poverty around the world faster than a lot of people think. However, we've got that big gap. So these big gaps in the next set of Millennium Development Goals, or Sustainable Development Goals, whatever they'll be end up calling, you're going to see a switch from levels, I think, to gaps. Health gaps, this gap and that gap will be becoming much more pronounced. Health issues. We're a much healthier world, but we've got some serious problems of new and re-emerging disease and immunization. I mean, you all know about the tuberculosis that you can't treat too easily anymore. These things may be increasing as we increase the population and concentrate people together in factory farming and put all these sort of things together. It's reasonable to assume we're going to have a lot of new diseases coming up. 9. How can education make humanity more intelligent, knowledgeable, and wise enough to address its global challenges? One of the things that's advocated in here, I'd like to see done, is why can't Department of Education in this country and the ministries of education in other countries declare increasing intelligence as an objective of education? It's not, it's not. We have socialization Okay, make them good citizens, and give them some knowledge. And somehow that'll make them smart. And it has for some people. Maybe that was genetics. We're learning an awful lot about cognitive science. The world is, by the way, in a brain race at the moment. You've got the Brain Project President Obama announced. You've got the Brain Project going on in European Union. You've got a Brain Project in China, and one been going on for a while in Japan. So now the race is on to how do we understand the brain, make it healthier and more intelligent, integrate that in implications into computers, so we create sort of a global conscious technology of getting people brighter and brighter and brighter. Now, I don't know a single country that has taken that seriously and say, well, therefore, we have an implication for education. We have to socialize, we got to educate, and improve brain functioning. We do bodybuilding. You know, everybody's got physical education, but we don't have brain building in the education system anyway. Okay, 10, we're winning on the nation-state war phenomena. It's reasonable to assume, yes, we got some tensions in the Crimea, yes, we got some tensions in the Pacific, yes, we got some tensions in the North Pole later on with getting access to oil. So we can still have some nation-state wars. However, it's reasonable to talk about nation-state wars maybe going the way of history. But the internal conflicts are increasing. That's the problem now. The UN was designed to stop country A from attacking country B. And I'm not saying the UN is responsible for their reduction, but they played a role, certainly. We now have to figure out how do we deal with internal stuff, the Syrias of the world, etc., the Venezuelas of the world, and the rest of these things. Because as those internal conflicts get rougher and rougher, because people get smarter about things, they're better connected with the internet, there's more people unemployed than before with a better education, and they got time to get organized and to have all kinds of social demonstrations, so that this instability potential is quite large. And as individuals get more powerful with weapons, we're looking at a very unstable world potentially. So although we can applaud the nation-state war going down, we got to redirect our attention. And by the way, when you think about it, much of our whole defense system is based upon defending and deterring nation-state war. Number 11, the status of women. Slowly but surely, the world is getting this message right, that as you include women in the political, economic phenomena, the social welfare of the whole country goes up. The research is clear as a bell, no question about it. And we're slowly winning in the data. Every year we update the data, and it's slowly going, not dramatic yet, but it's slowly going in the right direction. Organized crime, I am happy to report that Interpol has finally agreed it's going to put together a global complex in Singapore, finishing it up at the end of this year, to begin to create the system to put together a global strategy to address organized crime. Now, I want this really to be clear. There are tons of efforts trying to stop organized crime. I'm not denigrating that. But when you have this department dealing with racketeering, and this department dealing with drugs, and this department dealing with organs, and this department, and no coherence, this town knows about the problem of coherence. No coherence, but you've got to do this on a global basis. If everything is done perfectly in France, it doesn't matter. Organized crime is a global system. They're not taking seriously your borders. So we need a global strategy. And in the State of the Future report, we've got a nice little global strategy that's been embedded at senior levels of eight or more countries. And so hopefully now we can maybe explore some relations with Internet's, or not Internet, but Interpol's new approach to this. The UN's Department of Drug and Crime has called on each nation to have an integrated policy. Believe it or not, what is the integrated policy in the United States? I remember reading some of that a couple of years ago, but it's like a lot of Washington documents, motherhood and apple pie and everything is fine, but I don't know about the coherence yet, and then the coherence with other countries, because just enforcing is one approach, but we also have to set up traps. And I won't go into details on this, but we've got to really take seriously the idea of setting up traps for money laundering and a coordinated efforts, working one by one, a large systems going all the way down. But that's going into details. Energy, This is one we've got to watch a little bit, aside from having to produce a tremendous amount of energy coming up. But this is something I'm ambivalent about, and I'll look to my colleagues for their views on this. On one hand, I'm seeing efficiencies going very well in energy production and use in a lot of areas, and the potential for extraordinary efficiencies coming up, so that maybe there's not as much demand as we think. On the other hand, seeing all kinds of new usages and all kinds of stupidity going on, it may have more demand than I think. That's a contradictory position, and my colleagues can straighten me out on that. In any case, one of the things that we got to pay attention to is that people will say most of the new energy coming into the grids of the world are coming from renewable energy. So you figure, wow, we're winning. But they forget to say, however, the majority of energy used in the world is that not new stuff, because you're talking about this icing on the cake. The majority of it is still fossil fuel and nuclear. Yeah? Shell Oil Company used to have a nice little graphic going out showing all the new energy. But then if you take the box here about what is the amount of fossil fuel used between, I think it was 2000 to 2020 and 2020 to 2040, vastly more twice than the previous period before that. We've really had to change the energy base and efficiencies of the world, and my colleagues will talk some more about that. Science and technology is clearly accelerating. You're all familiar with Ray Kurzweil and company, making it clear that we are going very fast with technology. But we're going so fast, there's a lot of ethical questions coming up around a lot of this sort of stuff. Should we build a body of opinion of future ethics about technology? Like, do you have a right to clone yourself? Yes or no? And if the United States says, you don't have a right to clone yourself, and Switzerland says, come on over. All right, does your copy of you, is that a U.S. citizen? All right? These will be faced. I'm telling you, man, these are questions that will happen. Now, in law, we have, common law and judicial law and that sort of stuff. So there's a body of opinion there and judgment that you can draw on to make a judgment. All right? I think we futurists ought to create a body of future opinion on things, so that as these questions come up to the Supreme Court, or they come up in university courses or in businesses or whatever, you've got a pool of thought that you can take your time, because some of these questions, like the Switzerland thing, probably won't come up tomorrow morning, I hope, but it may come up relatively soon. So let's think about these things ahead of time. With one of the purposes of futures research, think of these things ahead of time, so that as these questions start to hit, then we've had some thought ahead of time about it. Global ethics, one of the areas of global ethics that is happening that people in the United States are not as aware of as other countries. There's an organization for international standards. Some of you may have heard of ISOs. A lot of Americans don't know about these things, but this is a global participatory system for ethics. What is the right way to run a business? What is the right way to build this? What is the right way to do that? Slowly but surely, the world is putting together a global ethical system right underneath our nose without even noticing it. It's evolved. There's thousands of these standards and all kinds of things. We're slowly evolving a global system of ethics. It's very nice to see that religions are interconnecting in many different ways around the world now. The interreligious dialogues are happening all the time. One of the things that may come up in the next foreseeable future is the idea that religion is a cultural value system that's not necessarily true or false, but it's a way that a culture says, this is the right way we want to be. But as long as your group says you're the truth and that group is not the truth, then we've got continued conflict. People don't argue. People might say, I like this bottle of wine better than that bottle of wine. But people don't usually, that I know of, shoot each other over that. It's a matter of taste. We don't know the truth of the universe, but we keep acting as if we do. And I think that because when you have more and more religions interacting with global dialogues and all these things, after a while they say, okay, well, you can work it out. This is a big drama coming up. Will we, as a species, mature enough that we understand we don't know everything? You know, it's the old story about the old geezer says, I don't know everything. The young teenager knows everything, right? So we're like this young teenager, me first, short term, me, not us, and we don't know everything, and let's work it out together. So the human species is more, 40% now, interconnected. So we're slowly getting it together, maybe. Imagine your human body. If you are not connected, if your nerves were not connected to your muscles and your ligaments and all that, you can't walk down the street. Well, 40% of our body, human body, is now connected. We're slowly getting it together. Okay, so here's the human agenda. Each one of these gets several pages overview, gets the information graphic you saw there, and gets some graphics and charts. It's got some descriptions, and it's got some suggestions for actions and so forth. All of this is in our collective intelligence system as well, and you can participate in it, and hopefully making ourselves together more intelligent. I picked out subjectively, this is not scientific here, this is purely subjective. I picked out a couple of things because people always say, well, what do the reports say? And it just says an awful lot of stuff. Believe me, it says an awful lot of stuff. So I picked out some that I thought were like high synergy impact stuff. 1, establish a U.S.-China 10-year environmental security goal to reduce climate change and improve trust. What do I mean, improve trust? China asked for strategic trust with the United States with military to military. The way that that can work is environmental security. That's where the common interest is. That's where we should focus fast and hard. Secondly, why not make them a 10-year goal, land a man on the moon sort of a thing? You know, not a competition with the Soviet Union, but a cooperation with China. The rest of the world can join in, but just start with 2 to begin with. And that is, I put those numbers there. These are the various global challenges that would be seriously affected in a positive way if this goal were announced and done. Grow meat without growing animals to reduce water demand and greenhouse gases. I mentioned that before. FAO study, I haven't seen it countered yet. FAO study 2006 said the animal industries has greater impact on greenhouse emissions than the transportation industry. Now, we focused on transportation, and I think that's good, but we haven't focused on food. I guess it's easier to say you have to change rather than I have to change. Third, seawater agriculture for biofuels, carbon sink, and food without rain. You know, if you're using coastal areas and salt water, you don't care about rain. Gets rid of the biggest problem agriculture has in thousands of years. Build global collective intelligence systems for input to long-term strategic plans. We need a system to think together about. You know, we're no longer just little tiny pockets of humans. We're an integrated human system. Financial crisis proved that, you know? So we need a way for us to think together in an organized, structured way. 5, create telenations connecting brains overseas to the development process back home. I want to tell you there have been many attempts and a lot of dollars spent in meetings on how do you bring back the brains to these countries, because the smart ones left and it's killing us that they're all gone. And they're just sending back money, making me dependent. Well, okay, the brain's not coming back. Everybody knows computer dating. Do the same principle. Leave the brain in the World Bank or the IMF, but then match them up with the development needs, because a lot of stuff doesn't have to be in the same room. You know, let the guy at the World Bank do once a week, 1 hour on evaluating a business plan. Then they're getting hotshot consulting free of charge for this, Department of Commerce back in wherever the country is. Establish trans institutions for more effective implementations of strategies. This is a little complex, but I'll try to make it very precise. It's also explained in the book. Imagine an entity whose governing body has on it 1 or 2 from government, business, universities, corporations, and international or regional systems, but not a majority of any one. Imagine the people who work in the organization come from all those categories, but not a majority of any one. Imagine the money for that organization comes from all those categories, but not a majority of any one. And then imagine the annual report proving value. You can show value to all those institutional categories, but not a majority of any one. That's a trans institution. That's what the Millennium Project is organized. Legally, we're a nonprofit organization because we don't have a trans institutional category yet. The advantage of this means that anything that you do has to make sense to the bottom line, right? has to make sense with knowledge because universities are there. Got to make sense politically because government is there. It's got to make sense values because NGOs are there. It's got to make sense in the larger arena or the international because the international is there. It also means that you can act through those categories when you need to. It also means that those categories act on you, so you become a little smarter. That's a different institutional structure than we're used to today. That institutional structure, in my judgment, is an important new addition to the institutional menu that we have to work with in the world. You can have a trans institution for AIDS, you can have a trans institution for anything. We happen to have a trans institution for futures research. It gives us an extraordinary flexibility. Detail and implement a global counter-organized crime strategy. That's in process, as I mentioned. Maybe next year I can give you a report that's some progress on that one. And use the State of the Future Index as an alternative to gross domestic product. I'm probably running too long here, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Another minute or two.
Another minute,
Deal with
okay.
hunger.
Okay. Okay. We had lunch, so that's been solved. All right. Here, there's a chapter. So all of that, by the way, is chapter 1. I told you that there's a lot of detail in this thing. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is on hidden hunger. Essentially, as I mentioned before, FAO says 30% of the world has got hidden hunger. In other words, they'll pass the test to say you've got enough calories, but your calories are making you an obese, sloppy person who's looking toward diabetes in a few years. That's a big problem worldwide. It does, and I'm talking about rich countries, poor countries, middle countries. It's worldwide phenomenon, hidden hunger. Got to be serious about that. There's a whole bunch of answers in there on how to address that. Next one, the coastal infrastructure, as I mentioned before. The whole coastal area, you've got half the population of the world is within 120 miles of coastlines. Okay?
Can we hear the next people, please?
Okay. Boy, tough. All right, very quickly. Reduce the likelihood of CMADs. This is one thing that I would like to engage with anybody here on. The technology to prevent, detect an individual making and deploying a weapon of mass destruction should be classified. It's not our business. Other governments can do that. There's things with mental health and child development to reduce the number of crazy people. That's a good idea. The area that's not being addressed yet is what's the public's role? During the Cold War, the public had no role other than paying taxes. Public was not involved. But in preventing an individual making and deploying a weapon of mass destruction, there is a role for the public. We don't know what that is yet, and we want to do a study on that. And because the Millennium Project has 50 nodes around the world, we're organized that we can do that. The Global Futures Intelligence System is up and online and in operation, integrating brains, data, and software. Because the woman is not happy with me, I am slowly moving fast. So the Millennium Project is put together by these institutional categories to become a trans institution, 50 nodes around the world. All of our stuff gets vetted through all these different areas, so it's a global report done through a global process, decentralized global process. We also produce the Futures Research Methodology Series. This is the largest internationally peer-reviewed set of methods on how to explore the future, which is also inside the collective intelligence system. And in case you're wondering, the way the Millennium Project is managed, the old idea is hierarchy. You defeat that with networks. You put networks together into nodes. You connect up nodes into fields of play, and then you connect up the fields of play, and that's how the Millennium Project works. Thank you.
You guys decide, Paul, you want to go?
Oh, yeah, I was going to have Dennis go first,
Dennis
then
go,
Paul's
okay,
going to be
great.
clean up. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to expand on a few issues in the report. Society is beset by many major existential issues with tremendous potential impacts. What is especially concerning is that these are occurring simultaneously with nearly unknown combinatorial implications. So all that I'm going to discuss is all going on at the same time. The climate and energy thing you've just heard about, we have the IPCC projections, and then we have what's really happening boots on the ground, and what's really happening is far greater and far faster than the IPCC, because the science is not yet in to allow the IPCC to include the positive feedbacks. These include the massive amounts of fossil methane and CO2 in the tundra and the ocean, which are outgassing. And by the way, methane is 22 times worse than CO2. The ocean acidification is reducing the ocean CO2 uptake, less sulfur coming from the oceans because of the ocean acidification, increased water vapor, altered albedo because of the ice and so forth. So tighten your seatbelt, we'll see what really happens with the climate. The debt issues, people allege this will lead to, before we get out from under the debt issues, greater inflation, greater taxes, and greater interest rates with some not too good implications. The machines are taking the jobs. Jerry alluded to this. There's excellent books on this. The first really good one, I think, was Martin Ford's Lights in the Tunnel. And then the MIT people came out and other people. We're short currently about 8 million jobs in this jobless run-up. The code word is productivity improvements. This is a code word for ever-increasing automation and robotization. The machines have hollowed out the middle class, supposedly, and as the machine intelligence gets better, it will take the professions. It's already starting, as I'll indicate. And as the nanorobotics gets better, the machines will take the crafts. It's not just climate. The entire ecosystem is crashing. We have freshwater problems, deforestation, pollution, fish stocks, on and on and on. Essentially, there's too many of us. We've been far too successful as the human animal. People allege we're short 40 to 50% of a planet now. As the Asians in their billions come up to Western living standards, or try to, and they're trying to at a very rapid rate, we're going to need, people tell me, 3 more planets. If NASA terraform Mars, which would take us about 120 years, that's only 1 planet. We need 3 more very shortly. So this business of econometrics based upon growth, I don't think the ecosystem is going to allow that. We're going to have to go to sustainability, and that has very interesting implications going forward. The humans are becoming cyborgs. This includes cochlear implants for hearing, artificial retinas for seeing, artificial hearts for living, and also brain chips. We've put some 10,000 brain chips into people to fix congenitally defective brains, and people are now working on brain chips to make us smarter. There's serious work which started out with the IBM Blue Brain Project on biomimetic human-level machine intelligence. This is where you nano-section the neocortex and replicate it in silicon, as opposed to soft computing to try to get to serious machine intelligence. The IBM Blue Brain Project was so successful, it's led to the multi-billion-dollar, I think it's $3.5 billion EU effort on the Human Brain Project, which led to the US efforts on the Human Brain Project and others. These people tell me that in 10 to 15 years, they think they can produce a human-level biomimetic machine intelligence, which, as you know, is the definition of the Kurzweilian singularity. We'll see if all that comes to pass. In terms of computing, we've come about 10 to the 9th on silicon since '59. Going forward, as you leave silicon and go to bio-optical, quantum, nanomolecular, and atomic computing, there's another 10 to the 8th to 10 to the 12th to go, except for quantum. We now have the D-Wave machine. We're into D-Wave 2. NASA Ames is involved with this with Google. Quantum computing for an increasing number of problems is alleged to be up to 10 to the 44th better, which is an interesting number. Society as a whole has swallowed the hook on this IT revolution, and we now are in tele-everything. Telework, we have 1/3 of the workforce which is now telecommuting. We have over 200 million Americans doing teleshopping. Teletravel, the US is past peak car, reduced short-haul aircraft, reduced long-haul aircraft projections. Telemedicine, teleeducation, I'll get into in a minute. Telecommerce is endemic. The IRS sent me a letter that says, please don't file on paper anymore. Telepolitics, we've had since the 60s. Telemanufacturing with the printing business is going to get interesting. Telesocialization. Overall, we are leaving the IT age and entering the virtual age. And the demonstration of 5 senses virtual reality, haptic, taste, touch, smell, sight, and sound, to make immersive presence really good is going to accelerate that. So what are some of the societal implications going forward? There's a possibility between the debt, the machines taking the jobs, and the sustainability problem, there's a possibility for reduced standards of living. In the energetics, Jerry mentioned it. It turns out that the plant world is broken up into glycophytes and halophytes. Glycophytes are freshwater plants and halophytes are saltwater plants. The Indian subcontinent has had a saline agriculture, growing food and fodder for hundreds of years, growing halophytes. There are 10,000 natural halophytes. These are salt-tolerant plants. They grow just as fast or can as freshwater plants. And then the fact that the 44% of the land worldwide is wasteland and deserts, and 97% of the water is seawater, and seawater contains 80% of the nutrients to grow plants. So if we did something fairly straightforward, like taking a good chunk of the Sahara, you plow it up, you irrigate it with the Mediterranean, and you grow biomass, you could grow enough biomass without touching fresh water and food. Now the rest of it, enough biomass to replace all the fossil carbon, to produce enough petrochemical feedstock for all the plastics, and grow an awful lot of food, because these halophytes are food-producing plants too. If we did this, we could return a large part of the 68% of the fresh water we're running out of that's now used for conventional glycophyte freshwater agriculture. Just halophytes on wastelands using seawater, which we have a surfeit of, solves in 10 to 15 years very affordably. The estimates for the fuel out of this is about $50 a barrel, about half of what petroleum is today. You could solve simultaneously land, water, food, energy, and climate, okay? All of that comes together. Then the humans are merging with the machines. It's not us versus them. We're merging, we're becoming cyborgs. And you know, how that'll run out is interesting to speculate on. It may end up with human-contaminated machines, I don't know. We could exploit the productivity and the decreasing cost of the products of the machines. The cost of real goods is on a downward spiral because of the productivity of the machines, and we could use all that to produce within the ecosystem structures very improved lives for the many. In terms of energy, distributed energy generation is the new guy on the block. This has got the power companies really worried. We have 200,000 off-grid homes now. 50% of the new production in energy is renewables. And then there's all kinds of new sources, including high-altitude wind. The jet stream off the U.S. East Coast could produce twice the U.S. installed grid power. If we floated heat exchangers in the Gulf Stream, that's twice the U.S. installed grid power. And then, courtesy of an outgrowth of MIT, there's Joule biotechnology with genomic cyanobacteria, which could produce, they say, 20,000 gallons per acre year using CO2 and wastewater and so forth. We are adopting to this virtual age. The younger generation is growing up on electrons. This is a natural societal shift of virtual everything. Society previously shifted from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. We shifted from agriculture to the industrial age, where we move people into the cities to run the machines and learn how to spell alienation. This time the communication, virtual education is in fact improving. We now create wealth by inventing things. In the industrial age, we created wealth by working natural resources. Today, we create wealth by inventing things. The key to inventing things is education. We now have teleeducation. There's 330,000 courses available on 35,000 websites, and increasingly it's free, and the quality is going up, and we can build a motivation into the software so that the kids can't not do it, and that includes the adults that need adult education, okay? So we could educate everyone increasingly free and raise all boats and create massive wealth, because we now create wealth by inventing things. people are worried about the costs of Medicare and Medicaid. Well, IBM took the Watson machine, which won Jeopardy, and they've now applied it to medicine. And what we're learning from that experiment and others is that telemedicine is very interesting because it turns out the machines know far more than the individual practitioner. And what we get out of the telemedicine is much better prevention, much better diagnosis, and much better treatment at much lower costs. You might have noticed that as we go to telemedicine and teleeducation, we reduce the number of teachers, we reduce the number of physicians. This all contributes to the fact that the machines are taking the jobs, okay? So, going forward, at some point, we will have to ask the question, what are the humans going to do all day? Now, as the report says, there's some good news and some serious issues. But both of these, the good news and the serious issues, involve potentially major changes, not the least of which is we're now extending human life at some 0.3 years per year, and some very prestigious medical people came out and said, the way that the bio-revolution is going, the synthetic bio-revolution, genomics, it's not untoward that within decades we could be extending human life at 1 year per year, which is kind of an interesting number. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Sounds like it's time to bring back leisure studies, right?
Yes.
Okay. Jury suggested that I clean up. I'm not sure that 5 minutes is enough to clean up all of the many issues here. Somewhere in his quotes, Jerry quotes me as saying this is the most important annual report on the future of humanity. And that's a pretty good quote. There have been a lot of studies. One question is, why do you want an annual report on the future of humanity? We once had a very active China node participant, Wang Rusong, who was basically a Taoist, very prominent in the Chinese government, but also a Taoist. And he said, of course, in Taoism, there is the future as it is now, and then there is the future as it will be, and we keep changing the future through our process of thinking it through and interacting. The great strength of this Millennium Project is exactly what Jerry said, the network of nodes internationally. Because if we think about the future with 10 well-educated people behind white walls in some little room in Washington, it's not a global dialogue. It's not collectively visioning and changing the future. And the fact that it's an international dialogue is critical. Now, I'm not representing NSF here, but I've been reminded that NSF also has a little critical thing, which is peer review. And people talk about peer review, how it can be screwed up. And I know 100 ways it can be screwed up. I've seen every way it can be screwed up. But at the same time, if you want to know what is the truth of these new technologies and these new dangers, it really helps if you can bring the world's top experts together for a really tough, in-depth, concrete discussion. And I'm very grateful to NSF for the 20-odd years I've had to learn a little bit about what the realities are. What are the real dangers? What are the real opportunities? In general, I'd say that the dangers facing us and the opportunities are both much, much larger than what most people imagine. And it's very important that we think about them consciously, because we won't be able to get to the real opportunities and avoid the serious dangers if we don't exert consciousness. We have to think. You can't fight entropy if you don't think. If you don't think, the enemy is entropy, and there are 100 forms of entropy. Living in Washington, D.C., you see quite a few of them. Jerry mentioned a few, and they're pretty overwhelming. But at the end of the day, the only force that's going to prevent entropy from killing us is exercising our consciousness, which means thinking about these seriously. Now, it's funny, there's some mention of the brain. I can't help commenting on that because I have a personal investment in that area among some of the others. Yeah, pretty heavy investment. Several years ago, the National Academy of Engineering listed reverse engineering the brain as one of the 14 grand challenges for all of engineering in the next many years. And partly because of that, I got a chance to brief some very high-level people on the possibilities for doing that. At NSF, on the webpage, you can still look up the letters COPN. which points to our notion of how we could do this reverse engineering and understand much better than we do. But there is a Washington stakeholder process, and the minute the White House says there might be money for the brain, you get so many people who want to use that money for so many things that have nothing to do with the goal. It's just overwhelming. Talk about entropy. There are people, when I went to school, I remember in the 1960s, Marvin Minsky was telling people in 20 years we'll have a human level of intelligence on Mars. Well, that was good for marketing, I guess. But it's like every year, it's 20 years from now, we'll have a human level intelligence. When I look at what it really takes to build a real intelligent system, what the technical tasks are as opposed to the BS, I actually have a game plan in press at the World Conference on Computational Intelligence in Beijing in June. And my estimate would be, based on the present rate of scientific progress, if we really work hard, in about 100 years, we might be able to reverse engineer the level of a mouse. Okay? That's about where we are. That doesn't mean we should all run around and act like mice. We wind up with two lives. One is the scientific life, where you try to understand the mouse, and the other is the human level, where you really pay more attention to that higher level of intelligence. You take what you've learned from the mouse. It can help illuminate the higher levels of intelligence. But remember, we do have to lead two lives for a while, more than two. There are a lot of people who want to do it quick and dirty. We know that medical costs have been going totally out of control. Many people will tell you the main thing that's threatening the whole U.S. economy and budget is the explosive, uncontrolled cost of medical entitlements. Medical costs. Those are the things that are driving us nuts. And a lot of that is people have discovered there are great gravy trains. Once upon a time, frontal lobotomies were a great gravy train. Let's just come in there and just cut things out. Okay? There was another time when heroin was a great technology breakthrough that people were excited by, ushering in a new era. Well, it ushered in a new era, all right. We're still struggling with it. A lot of the current efforts to manipulate or control the brain without first understanding it, which we're 100 years away from, a lot of those efforts, in my view, are closer to heroin than they are to frontal lobotomies. They are very dangerous, and there are a lot of dangerous things going on right now. There are bioethics efforts right now, but my impression is the way gravy trains work, the bioethicists complain, and you say, okay, we'll give some money for the people who want to turn you into cyborg, some money for people who want to control your brain, and we'll have the cyborg people report to the control people, and we'll carve out a certain percentage for the philosophers. And when they're asked to speak about bioethics, the main thing they'll talk about is, you've got to make sure you give money to philosophers. We've got to have our share of the take. And I'm not really making that up. There was a major presidential commission on bioethics and the initiative of the brain, webcast from Philadelphia. I think if you look up Presidential Commission Bioethics, you'll see it's still on the webpage. You can see and make up your own mind for what people said. And you might see that what I'm saying is not entirely science fiction. So there are serious dangers, but there are serious opportunities. Because how can we control these dangers if we don't make full use of our own consciousness? And how can we make use of our full consciousness if we don't work on understanding ourselves and intelligence better? There is a huge scientific opportunity for understanding, which links in to the natural agenda of human potential, and you don't have to put wires in people's heads to advance the fundamental human potential. Anyway, so thanks for your patience. Sorry I went over.
Okay, I think we've got enough to chew on the table. So we've got microphones around the room here. People, just raise your hand. We'll get you a mic because we're webcasting this. We want to make sure the people that are looking in from afar get a chance to hear what you're asking. Let's see, yeah, right, okay, here. Hold on a sec. And if you got a specific question, why don't you direct it to someone, one of the people up here, or you can just ask everyone.
This is for, is this on? This is for the whole panel. It's incredible. One of the themes that I'm hearing is how dependent on electrons we are and will be going forward, whether it's collective intelligence, whether it's education, whether it's accomplishing many of the solutions to these challenges that we mentioned. The question I have is, what do we do if someone pulls the plug?
Like EMP, we might go back to the Stone Age.
Yeah, never has a society, you've hit it right on the head. Never has a society made such a massive vulnerability as we have with all this electronics. The electronics is buried in everything. There was a congressional EMP commission that looked at what could people do with a not very capable missile, with a not very big bomb detonated in a certain altitude range over the middle of the country, and essentially took us back to, as I remember, the 1830s before the telegraph. And, you know, stuff stopped. And we no longer have animals to pull the plows. And, of course, the tractors are full of electronics, and so we'd have to use people to pull the plows, and this might be uncomfortable. So, you know, what we do about all this is not at all clear. Everybody worries about cyber. The EMP thing is, you know, equally bad. And cyber is now, I think, listed as a WMD, weapon of mass destruction, along with the rest of them. You know, as is EMP. This is going to take a lot of work, and we're going to have to get awful lucky in the meantime.
Yeah, I agree completely with Dennis, and which is not always the case, but this is one where I think the science is incontrovertible. I remember a couple months ago going to a meeting, a briefing on the Hill, where a Republican congressman and a Democratic congresswoman both spoke. The Republican congressman, Trent Frank, said he's in charge of a committee that gets all the worst threats to our survival passing through his desk. He said the first few months of that job, it was a real nightmare. Everybody was doing their best to terrify him as plausibly as they could. And he said of all of these threats, the one which worried him the most was EMP, because you can get it from a solar flare, you can get it from maybe one Iranian nuclear bomb in the wrong place, and there are even portable terrorist weapons. The potential is there to knock out half the big transformers in the U.S. There was a report by the National Academy of Sciences which said that if we have another Carrington event, like what we did 100 years ago, conservatively, it would be $1 trillion or $2 trillion worth of damage. But in the committee hearing, they said, look, they just said that to be on the safe side. They know it's worse than that. Because if you knock out half the transformers of this country for 18 months, the power that runs the refineries comes from these things. The power that runs the ammonia factories, which makes the fertilizer that keeps the farms going, depends on these things. Modern farms are not like little people 2,000 years ago off in their own enclave. Most farmers will tell you they're dependent on the seed company. Seed company shuts down for the year, don't expect that much extra food out there. And if 90% of your population can't eat for a little bit, like a year, I would tend to assume civil violence becomes a possibility. And so the bottom line is, what's scary is this is a test of our consciousness and sanity. The House passed a bill 3-1 called the SHIELD Act. Their estimate was $1 billion or $2 billion of investment would get rid of a 10% per decade probability of going back to the Stone Age. Now, I run the numbers. It's a no-brainer. And even if you take the low number of damages, $1 trillion risk, a 10% probability, and the insurance costs $1 billion, why can't we do that? And the people in the House also say that, and they say they don't know where the bill went in the Senate. They just literally don't know where it went. Congressmen are speculating. They don't know where it went. By the way, this is all my personal opinion. Nothing represents NSF.
There's a man, Dr. Michael McDonald, runs the U.S. Resilience, I don't know, Institute or Center, but if you do a Google search, Michael McDonald's U.S. Resilience, he and teams around the world are now training people. What I would call first responders are the people themselves, not necessarily the police and fire department and so forth. And there's a concerted effort. It needs to grow rapidly around the world. And if you're interested, you can do a Google search and get involved with that. But those they're up in New York doing some training. They're in Haiti doing some training, in Japan, and so forth. Because what happens if what they just said happens? Well, then should we, as honorable futurists, what do we think about? What do we train now, if that happens? So that's one part. The second part is Chapter 4 gets into the lone wolf mass destruction stuff. It was the first cut on some of the information. We want to do another cut on that. If you're interested, or anybody else, we can talk about that. But this is one of the ones that keeps us all up at night, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, all the way in the back.
Thank you. My name is Jeremy Pesner. I do a number of things, but one of my side ventures right now is what I call the Israeli Knowledge and Innovation Exchange in STEM, or IKE STEM for short. And it's meant to bring young American and Israeli STEM professionals together to work on forging new collaborative relationships in order to solve these grand science and technology challenges. So my question for all of you, given that, is how young early career people like myself and these Israelis and Americans I'm talking about, how can they get involved in these grand challenges? How can we how can folks like us really participate and become more aware of what the Millennium Projects and related institutions are doing? Most of us are still, at this point in our lives, are still trying really hard to establish our careers, and most of us might not be as aware of this vast interdisciplinary, interlinking system that the Millennium Project helps to provide. So how can we sort of tie our interests and growing talents in with these grand challenges that we have before us?
There is a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that particularly this society and most others are terminally tactical, and most of these grand challenges we're talking about are long-term strategic.
Right.
Okay? So there is no, what Jerry's doing is essentially a Paul Revere operation. Okay, he's wandering around trying to, get people to think about these kind of things. But there's no organized groups that I'm aware of, and I've turned over every rock that I know of in this whole business, where people are seriously worrying about this stuff, where you can make a connection and hop in and start stirring a pot, okay? This is almost like a self-organization on the web operation for any one of these things. People are not yet aware, many people, I mean, this is a self-selected group with a cognoscenti, okay? Most people are not yet aware of the issues, much less that there needs to be a concerted effort to worry about something that's not in the near term. I mean, the Chinese have a 1,000-year planning cycle, the Japanese 140 years, and the U.S. planning cycle is anywhere from 3 months on Wall Street to the 4-year presidential election cycle. I consult for companies and their strategic planning, and 5 years is forever, okay? And these kind of issues that we're talking about are 15, 20, 30-year issues.
Several ways you can get involved. Forgive the commercial. This is a damn good book. Read it. You get $10 off today. It's $29.95. Tomorrow is $39.95. One is to read this and then share it with other people to increase the awareness that Dennis just referred to. Second, you'll see in here the list of all the nodes. We have a node in Israel. We also have a node in Iran. And they collaborate, believe it or not. So you can contact the Israeli node and get involved. They were the ones that initiated that CMAD study, by the way. That was an Israeli initiative. Second, you can, if this was interesting and you want to start to participate with it, that's the purpose of the Global Futures Intelligence System. It is a participatory system. You all can subscribe to it, come in, participate in the areas you want to, and there's a variety of ways to participate in it. And the guy sitting right to your left, raise your hand there, Wes. Wes is writing the code. And he can tell you how you can actually participate in that system now. So use the collective intelligence system, read the book, and get a hold of the Israeli node, and you'll be in business.
Okay, here.
I'm Helen Raffel. I recently taught for 2 years at Sichuan University. I taught environmental science. And of your suggested 4 or more projects that could be undertaken, the very first one you mentioned was U.S.-China cooperation. So I'd like to know what's being done along those lines. Do you have any idea of what's being started or carried out?
There's actually a signed ministerial agreement signed by Secretary Clinton, and she was Secretary of State, and her counterpart in Beijing. Anybody here actively working in the State Department? I know there's a retired guy. Anybody working in the State Department right now? Aha, they're going to watch this on video. Lazy. Anyway, okay. You can get a hold of this. You can call up the Office of Public Information or whatever, State Department, and get a hold of the agreement. The agreement basically says the two countries will cooperate to do something.
Are they doing anything?
But at least you got a piece of paper say you're supposed to do it. Now, as a tax-paying citizen, you can say, how you doing on this implementation? And you can goose it along. I mean, you know, there's power of goosing things along. So I would ask you, one, to get a hold of the State Department, Office of Public Information.
Don't you know what's going on?
I haven't seen the progress yet. But that doesn't mean other people, I mean, you know, come on, all of it. The more pressure we put on these agreements to be, you know, to take it the next step, the more likely they will. So, you know, all these people are calling up about this. Are you kidding? They really care about this? Yeah.
Another area Jerry has worked on is this area of back-channel diplomacy. Not everything has to go through the State Department. There are other ways to advance life. One small thought that comes to my mind is there's a place called IFCE, the International Fund for China's Environment, which has meetings. I think there's one coming up this week, which I'm really sorry I have to miss because my schedule's impossible, but it should be a lot of fun. There's a congressional briefing where the Chinese will be trying to communicate with the Congress about how to address common environmental problems. What I'm really puzzled by, I see these newspaper accounts of people choking in Beijing and even Xi'an. And I look at that, and I know a lot of it is due to things like particulates from coal. And I know that California has a technology. There's a little company called Calera, and Senator Barbara Boxer loves that company. We're not sure how far along they are. But if I had the problems Beijing has, I wouldn't be easily deterred from taking action. I would be working very hard if I lived in Beijing to try to see how hard you could push the possibility of the Calera technology to solve some of those crucial environmental problems in Beijing. And if the United States has any sense at all, it will be helpful and facilitatory to help people stop choking in Beijing.
Yeah, the Calera process, they're taking the waste CO2, and they take the waste emissions, CO2 emissions, and recycle that into making building material. That's the idea. So you're reusing stuff. When people talk about carbon sequestration, they also got to talk about reuse. We got to pull it out and reuse it. That's what it's a big building material.
And it's a lot cheaper than carbon sequestration in the earth, which has some questionable risk aspects. This is much safer, much cheaper, and it has a small side effect. You put these Calera units on a coal-fired plant, it also takes out the particulates and the SOx, which is what people are choking on. In a way, it's a poor man's scrubber. And boy, a poor man's scrubber would sure be good for a lot of folks in Beijing. It does take work. It's not the kind of technology you get off the shelf from 20 years ago. But we're not going to solve any of our real problems with 20-year-old established technology. We have to be ready to move ahead to have any chance of solving these things.
All the way back there.
I'm Diane Perlman. I'm at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So anyway, first of all, speaking about efficiency and stupidity, one comment, I have a patented invention to eliminate the need for paper, plastic, and styrofoam, which is very wasteful. But my question is, you were talking about, violence, wars, and internal conflicts, and of course all this violence, in addition to the human destruction, also environmental destruction. And our ways, right now we're witnessing escalation of cycles of violence, and the knowledge that we apply to it is very concrete, black and white, primitive, often has the opposite of coercive pressure. And there are bodies of knowledge we know much more about analyzing the underlying conflict, reducing tension, transforming conflict. So I'm wondering how that, there's much more we can do that's much more elegant and conscious than the kind of immature approaches that we use now, which often have the opposite effect.
Much of what's happening is going to, I think, incite more violence. The huge income disparity that Jerry referred to is not making people happy and is going to make them a lot unhappier. Some of you may have read the Will and Ariel Durant little book that they wrote on the 10 lessons of history, and one of them is the Stolic, Diastolic, wealth accumulation versus wealth dispersion, revolution cycle. The other thing is some people tell me that the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement were at least partially instigated by the fact that machines are taking the jobs. You have a lot of younger people, highly educated, with no jobs, okay? So that plus many of the other issues that I went through and that are in Jerry's report, the outlook is for probably more violence for many reasons. And that's why we need to, I like the climate for a place to rally around and build a global consilience, okay, as a common enemy, the enemy being us, okay, our effect upon the climate and the planet, and let's fix the ecosystem and let's work together to do it. And believe it or not, that will improve the economies, that will improve the job situation, that will reduce the violence business.
Yeah, let's do one more question.
Thank you. I'm Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. I guess my question is, how do you reconcile all these trends, with the predominant political objective, which is growth, 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 and a little bit more growth, and jobs and some more growth, when in fact the human species is overwhelming the planet already? Does your study look at whether or not we need to make more transformative changes and how we can make those paradigm shifts, and if indeed we will? Thanks.
Sure, that's almost the entire thrust of the whole book. I mean, that's the thrust of the whole, I mean, you take those, 4 or 5 goals I ticked off, all those are transformative. I mean, if you really had a U.S.-China cooperation on environmental security, that would go a long way to making some transformations in decision-makings and political systems and so forth. Now, we are also taxpayers and voters. We're electing people that don't do much. Well, Franklin was really clear in the early days of the U.S. democratic stuff. If you don't have an educated public, you don't have a democracy. It's the keystone. Remember, he said he had the keystone of democracy was educated and active public. If you don't like what they're doing, made a ruckus. Now, I was at the Cancun UN meeting on climate change some years ago. And one of the things I walked away from that was the governments were not doing it, right? Everybody says government's not doing it. Fine. But what was happening in that meeting were agreements between businesses, universities, and mayors' offices, municipalities. So I'm slowly seeing a shift, especially in the environmental area, away from expecting central governments to do it, and increasing numbers of mayors to do it in collaboration with universities and businesses.
This issue of sustainability and growth is is one we've had lots of debates on. One of the beautiful things about these international nodes and debates is you really do have interesting discussions. One of the very prominent people active in the Millennium Project is Hazel Henderson, who is very well known for going around the world saying we should stop using GNP as a measure of well-being and we should look into sustainability as opposed to economic growth. And I've had some friendly debates with her because a couple of my degrees are in economics. And we shouldn't stereotype economists as all being dinosaurs. They're not all dinosaurs. Really serious economists think about things like price indices, divisia indices. At the end of the day, you can have economic growth in real terms relative to concepts like divisia indices, which do not necessarily imply that you're using more and more materials and more energy. In fact, at a certain level of development, let's think about the size of a house. At a certain level of house, people who are reasonably honest and sane realize that having a house 3 times as big might actually be a negative utility to you. You have to clean it up, you gotta worry about all this space, you gotta walk from one side to the other. So there comes a point when, as your income rises, the marginal value of more material consumption decreases. There's even a whole literature on dematerialization. So you can have natural market-based economic growth with a decreasing percentage of your GNP going to things like irreplaceable raw materials. So we can sort of have our cake and eat it too if we're smart. Now, will we be smart? Or will we have dinosaur lobbies telling us, no, we got to consume more and more of the old stuff even if we're about to run out of it? We have real problems with that. If we had time, we could talk about them, but we sure do have problems. We got to make a big adjustment. Economic sustainability is going to require technology changes. It's going to require getting rid of corruption in a lot of places. It's not easy, but it's certainly, as Jerry says, it's embedded in a lot of the specific challenges.
There's a fundamental issue that underlies your question. And the fundamental issue is that in the industrial age, when technology was more or less kind of linear, the state of play in technology and the state of play in society, there was a lag of 10 to 12 to 15 years, okay? Today, with the double exponential IT, bio, nano, quantum energetics, tech revolution, all simultaneous, okay, this lag between all the societal precept structures and what you asked about and the real technical state of play has just gone unimaginable, okay? This is why in my opening remarks I said all of this stuff is occurring at the same time. The combinational effects of these have not been investigated at all, okay? People look at 1 or 2 of these things, but not in any kind of synergistic way, okay? So we are essentially, some of you may remember Marshall McLuhan, okay, who said we are marching forward to Tomorrowland with our feet firmly planted in Bonanza Land, Bonanza being a popular TV show at the time, okay? This is what we do, only now it's getting worse, okay? This is why we need much better education. This is why Jerry's global education precepts are so important, okay? To give people the information so that they even know that this is an issue.
Well, Jerry, I think you have a little inflection point in your State of the Future Index. As you said, it was starting to tick up, and it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see where that is next year, and we will be back next year to look at it.
Good.
So thank you all.
Thank you. Good. Now, that's recorded. Now we can figure out what we said.
Oh, we don't all go into jail.
Jerry, do you have a card? Thanks a lot. I'd like to chat.
Apologies for my outburst.
Are you in Washington?
Apologies for my outburst. I got out of
That really sort of was a hell of a downer.
Was it? I am so apologize.
Good to meet you, finally.
You're giving me this because
You're in Washington too. I'd like to get
I
together.
think I first heard your name long, long ago.
We're trying to grapple
It was
with
in reference to some hypersonic.
I work hypersonics.
Somebody was here.
Oh, okay, so that, sorry. Yeah, I was